Come down here. Um, Before we begin, Margaret, you had raised something last week that I think is important, which was, the information that I'm presenting, I dare say you've never heard before. I certainly hadn't heard it until I began my investigation into it. And it's difficult for us to say, why haven't we heard these things before? And the question you raised, possibly, is there some middle ground between the official story and this information that's here? Indeed, it is possible. Um, the source material from which I've derived to create this course comes from those two major works that you have on your syllabus right there, Secret Agenda and Silent Coup. And as I said last week, if this course has been of significant interest to you, pick them up and read them. And I would start with Silent Coup because it's very readable. Jim Hogan's work on Secret Agenda is a little more dense, but once you have the framework that the other authors have put together, Hogan's work ties in. And today we'll be getting into Hogan's work, looking at what the CIA is trying to carry out. But before we do that, I now want to reference the third work that's on your source material right there. I'll hold it up here. I have a copy. This one is called, you probably see it in reverse. Could put it so that the light isn't on it. It's called Chasing Shadows. And this is by Ken Hughes. And I'm going to lead off with this today because as another author who I'm not on the source list here, but I mentioned last week, Glenn Graff, has said Watergate really, although we are dealing with it specifically to the events of 1972, is a mindset that existed over the Nixon administration. And what I'll present to lead off with today reflects that. So let me start my share and we'll begin today. And as always, I always like to get a little humor out of the episode titles and riffing off of movie titles. So today is Sex, Lies, and Audio Tape. You'll remember that prominent independent movie from way back in the 80s, Sex, Lies, and Videotape. Well, we're doing audio tape, but the subject matter is the same. All right, so here we go. And look at this photograph of Richard Nixon. This is how he saw himself. Happy, joyous, victorious. He's out there in front of a campaign event and he's feeling good. This is how he wanted to be all the time. But as I note here, before resuming our exploration of events leading up to the resignation, I want to look back to see how things hovered over Nixon in 1969, okay? And really the year before. I want to take you back to March of 1968, when President Johnson made that startling announcement that he wouldn't seek or accept the nomination for his party. This, of course, is coming in the aftermath of two major events. One in Southeast Asia, and that was the Tet Offensive that was really almost a 2-month-long event. It was in January through March of 1968, a military initiative carried out by the National Liberation Front throughout all of South Vietnam. And the second event was the results of the New Hampshire primary. And although Johnson won that primary, he came within a hair's breadth of losing it to the upstart Democratic, the candidacy of the upstart Senator Eugene McCarthy. And McCarthy, as you may or may not know, he had declared his candidacy, but he hardly ran any campaign at all. It was a campaign that he was really just running from Washington, D.C. But many young people, particularly those in college on the East Coast, heard that clarion call, and they're the ones that got out and were campaigning for him, especially in New Hampshire, doing a door-to-door campaign. And because a lot of them were, young people in college, they were letting their hair grow long, they all cleaned up their act. And there was a famous phrase, clean for Gene. So they all went out and got haircuts, they put on sports coats, and they went door to door throughout New Hampshire advocating his campaign. And it had a huge difference in the Democratic campaign. Well, on the heels of that, Johnson came out and said, this is too much for me. I'm not going to run, I won't be drafted, and I'm going to spend my remaining time in office trying to resolve this matter. Peace in Vietnam. And again, this is a wonderful photograph. I think it's significant because what it really is telling us, for so much, our involvement in Vietnam was having Black men fight a white men's war against yellow men. And there is a photograph right there showing Black Vietnam vets hanging out, hanging low during the Tet Offensive. Well, toward this goal, Johnson was going to reduce the bombing campaigns that we had over both North and South Vietnam. And as I've mentioned before, this bombing campaign, known as Rolling Thunder, although there were many iterations of it, delivered more munitions over this rural environment than all the bombs delivered in both theaters of war during World War II. And LBJ attempted to open peace negotiations between Washington and Hanoi because he was trying to resolve this conflict, if at all possible, before he left office in January of 1969. Well, let's introduce Henry Kissinger into this mix. Now, he had been a Harvard professor, but he'd become a protege of Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York. He was asked to be on the diplomatic team for LBJ when this team was meeting with the representatives in Paris. So Kissinger was pretty well tied into what was being discussed. And while ostensibly he's serving LBJ, he used his relationships with these prominent Republicans to keep the opposition party informed about the progress of negotiations. And then early in 1969, shortly after March, once it was clear that Nixon and not Rockefeller, because Rockefeller aspired to the presidency in 1968, that Nixon would become the Republican nominee, he became the beneficiary of Kissinger's information. And again, once again, I call your attention to this wonderful photograph of Richard Nixon at a rally there. And look at him, for this person who was so socially awkward. Look at him on the stage right there. He's in his bliss, you know? Anyway. Well, Nixon, he wasn't so happy about these events because he figured out that if LBJ moved forward with the peace process, it wouldn't look so good or perform so well for his campaign. And he began to think, well, if I could thwart LBJ's peace initiative, of which Kissinger was keeping him informed, I could benefit from this. So here's what happened. Nixon communicated to the Saigon government that if it would abstain from the peace negotiations under LBJ, it would get a better deal under a potential Nixon administration. And in the image that I'm showing here, here is President Thieu of South Vietnam, and he's considering this. Nixon used the back channel. So Nixon was using back channels long before he was ever in office. And here he's using Anna Chennault, seen in the photograph here. Now, Anna was a Chinese-born wife of World War II notable Claire Chennault. Now, that name may not be familiar to you, but in the late 1930s, Claire Chennault was an Army Air Forces colonel who was advocating a new policy of developing fighter planes for the military, and he was ill-regarded by the brass above him. So he retired, but he was immediately hired by the Kuomintang government in China. That is the nationalist government under China, Chiang Kai-shek. And Claire Chennault led the Chinese Air Force versus the Japanese forces once that conflict erupted in 1937, 38, 39. We will later know Claire Chennault when that force transformed into the Flying Tigers, okay? And then post-war, Claire Chennault turned that Flying Tiger fighter operation into Flying Tiger Air Transport. Now, he passed away, but his wife here, Chinese-born Anna, she was the beneficiary of a tremendous amount of goodwill toward Claire and his wealth. And she was living in Washington, D.C. at this time. And Nixon, although not directly, turned to her to carry a message to President Thieu of South Vietnam. And of course, the message is stay away from Paris. And this message was received and accepted. Now, it's also very possible that Thieu would never have participated anyway, because he could foresee what was eventually going to happen to his country. With his refusal to attend the Paris negotiations that Johnson had fostered, and that the North Vietnamese were participating in, the peace talks collapsed, and any effort to try and resolve this during LBJ's remaining months in office evaporated. And there he is. Doesn't this look like him? The weary warrior. He would leave office without his self-imposed moral duty left undone. And as we know, Nixon was elected president to some degree based upon his secret plan that he would deliver peace with honor in South Vietnam. Again, there he is with his victory, his signature victory gesture. Now, whether this was of Nixon's doing or not, U.S. combat troops would continue to suffer, and more than 21,000 Americans would die in combat during the next 7 years, and wounded warriors would amount to the hundreds of thousands. And the number of Vietnamese casualties, mostly civilian.
No, not for the first blow.
They would number in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions. So this collapse of peace negotiations will have tremendous consequence. Now, LBJ, he was aware of Nixon's back channel. He'd been using intelligence services to secretly record Nixon's communications wherever he went during his campaign. LBJ even called Nixon on the phone, informing him of his knowledge of this treasonous action, although he did blame Nixon's subordinates, not Nixon himself directly. And you can hear these conversations online. They're available. Now, Nixon's actions were treasonous in that they're a violation of the, albeit an 18th century law, the Logan Act, say nothing of the immoral impact on US service personnel and Vietnamese civilians. And while LBJ knew and warned Nixon of his treason, he didn't make it known to the American people during this presidential campaign. Now, he's finding out about it in the late weeks of it, because LBJ felt that if it had an effect on one of the candidates, had known to been a traitor, that could have a very negative effect on the American people. Because what happens if this guy is elected and half or all of the people now know that he's treasonous? It would make his administration wounded right from the get-go. So LBJ stayed silent. Now, it's worth noting that Nixon had a 30-point advantage over his rival, who would be Hubert Humphrey, coming out of the close of that, that upheaval known as the Democratic Convention in Chicago. But Nixon's advantage steadily declined in the days and weeks leading up to the election as the campaign moved forward. And in fact, the lead up to the election, had it gone on just a little bit longer, a week or so, it's likely that Hubert Humphrey would have defeated Nixon in the '68 election. But Nixon was elected nonetheless. But here it comes. Among his first actions as president was to find out whether a record of his treason was in the hands of his enemies, the Democratic Party. And that's where Thomas Charles Houston enters the scene. Now, we talked about Houston last week, but what we spoke about last week with him trying to find a happy marriage among all the intelligence agencies, his first assignment coming in was to find out if this damaging information was out there, and if so, where is it? Now, Houston began his work, and he determined that, I don't think it's out there. But if it is out there, where a copy of this report on this back channel negotiation with Anna Chennault going to President Tew, it could be in a vault over at the Brookings Institution. Now, Brookings Institution, for those of you who aren't aware, is a think tank, a long-established think tank in Washington, D.C. And Nixon was always very suspicious of it. He found them to be left-leaning. And Houston said, well, they might have a copy in their vault. So guess what? Nixon advocating that a fire be started at Brookings Institution. And while firemen are responding to this arson, some of the president's men, dressed as firemen, would enter the building, use explosives to blow the vault, and take whatever documents were there regarding Nixon's treason. I guess he wanted it back pretty bad. Now, this action never occurred. I've heard Thomas Charles Houston talk about it, and he says, well, because what they wanted to do was to buy a used fire truck, paint it like a DC fire truck, and they never wanted to spend the money on the fire truck, so it never happened. But I dare say others, cooler heads, say, this is a little crazy. We don't know what's there, and we'd be, right off the beginning, we don't want to be doing felonies, okay? But the president is on audio tape advocating this surreptitious activity. We got to go in there, we got to start a fire, and when we're in there, we got to blow the vault and get any papers. So this too, you can hear online. So having Nixon on tape advocating felonies is nothing new. Well, Houston, as we discussed last week, he went on to serve the White House in other programs. But I have to say, I just love this photograph. Now, this is a photograph of Houston when he appeared before the Senate Select Committee. But I love the outfit he has on there. You know, he's got it is the 70s. Okay, so a lot of it is explained that way with the wide lapels, you know, both on the shirt and on the tie. But with Houston here, I love that slight tint that he has to those heavy rimmed glasses and the ever-present pipe in his mouth. Yeah, this was a time when people smoked, you know, both cigarettes, but the ones that were most ostentatious were the pipe smokers. And they would use the whole ceremony of lighting their pipe during an investigation to buy a few minutes for, or a few little time for themselves while they put together their answer. And Houston was very much like that. Anyway, let's change up here. So that's what I wanted to introduce to you. As I said, that information is in a great deal of detail in a very readable book by Ken Hughes called Chasing Shadows. And indeed, it is Nixon chasing his own shadow and, you know, making himself so vulnerable to felony charges. But speaking of felony charges, let's go to the CIA. They like to listen in because spooks appreciate a love story, don't they all? Well, let's get back to what I was intimating last week, and we're going to get into it in a lot of detail this week. And in some ways, it's quite humorous. This, what I will reveal today, is what Watergate is actually about. When the DC police shut down a call girl operation located near DuPont Circle, and those who've been to DC have a familiarity where DuPont Circle is at, a brand new call girl operation was set up at Columbia Plaza Apartments, which is just a short distance away from the Watergate complex. It's like whack-a-mole. You knock it down here, it pops up over there. And this call girl operation was financed by the local underworld boss. Now, when this operation was set up, the CIA was right there when the girls came in, along with organized crime. They knew a good thing when they saw it. Now, as mentioned in other courses that I've presented here, the relationship between organized crime and overt government, often, but not always an intelligence agency, is the original definition of deep state. The American or the Canadian historian, but he's had a long career in the US here, Peter Dale Scott, he coined this term back in the 70s, deep state. And it is the long-standing relationship between organized crime and government. Government needs organized crime to do things that it cannot or doesn't want to be seen doing. And organized crime needs government to carry out its activities. It can't do what it does because the government knows about it, but it allows it to carry out gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. Now, we've introduced this gentleman last week, at the end of last week, James McCord Jr. He's operating under a cutout. That's an intelligence term for a phony operation known as McCord Associates. He ostensibly had left the CIA after 19 years to make more money, but he's out there doing private contract work, but still working for CIA. And what his role in with this call girl operation at Columbia Plaza, He's the one who installed transmitting devices both in the bedrooms there and on their telephone, so that everything that is heard out of that operation is transmitted. And here's where it is going. At a nearby location where they have line of sight, because that's crucial to the technology at the time, all incoming and outgoing phone calls and on-site conversation, and I dare say spankings and other sexual activity, all of this was susceptible to CIA surveillance. And the person who was charged for, who was on the receiving end, is this gentleman I see show in the photograph here. This is Lou Russell. This was McCord's, this is one of his associates. He was at a line of sight location to Columbia Plaza with a receiver and a tape recorder, so that everything coming across was recorded and available for review and use in the future. Now, the clientele coming into this call girl operation at Columbia Plaza were predominantly Democrats, simply because of its proximity to the DNC at Watergate. And you could see in the foreground here the Watergate complex, but if you look into the upper left corner of this photograph, that's the approximate location of the Columbia Plaza apartments. I'll have a better photograph later and I'll use my cursor to mention it, but you can see it's just 2 blocks away, walking distance. Also, pertinence, I don't want to leave it too quickly, you will see adjacent to the Watergate complex here, in the center foreground, the white multi-story building, that's the Howard Johnson Motor Inn right there. That'll prove consequential as we go forward. Now, even though many of the people coming into this call girl operation are Democrats, the clientele included a broad range of fine, upstanding men, doctors, lawyers, lobbyists, judges. And the recorded conversations were all turned over to CIA for potential blackmail. But more often, what was going on was this. It would help them develop psychological profiles of the men to be used at a later date. Oh, does this guy, is he into spanking? Is he into cross-dressing? Is he into anal? Is he into this or that? And we'll use this down the road because CIA plays a long game. Everything was working fine until someone got greedy. Isn't that always the case? I'm going to change up here and I'm going to introduce a wonderful fellow to you. Again, I doubt you ever heard of him. The official story doesn't include him, but he's so consequential to it. Philip Macon Bailey, as I say here. For a good time, call Philip Macon Bailey, or as I like to gag on his name, Philip Macon Bacon. Here he is. He's a really well-dressed, pug-nosed Irishman. He's an attorney, defense attorney in DC, and his clientele are petty criminals, drug dealers, and prostitutes. The finest America has. But he's got a thriving business. Well, Philip, he is quite the fellow. He had this inordinate ability, remember, this is the 70s, to persuade young women to sleep with him and then pose naked as he photographed them. Now, today, we don't think much of this. Everybody's, trading selfies. But in the 70s, that he could persuade, he'd go out to a bar, pick a girl up, take her back to his apartment, they'd have sex, and then, oh, honey, can I have a souvenir? I love you so much. And she'd allow him to photograph her with a film camera. And he would have it developed and printed and he kept a long cabinet of women who were his conquests. In law school, Bailey had been voted the classmate most likely to be disbarred. And as I noted here, Bailey's practice included prostitutes and party girls, and plus with his free swinging lifestyle, it had spilled over into an alliance with a woman I'm going to introduce to you, Erica, or Kathy. She went by several different names. Bailey didn't know it at the time, but Kathy Dieter, her true identity and real name was Erica Ricken, or she often went by Heidi. This is a woman who between 64 and 66 had performed as a stripper at the Washington's Blue Mirror Club. And we can see her in a photograph below here. I'll go into it for a little closer look right here. This is Erica on the right. She's the blonde. And on the left is Josephine Alvarez. She is a burlesque queen. And in between them is Joseph the Possum Nesling. He is the godfather of organized crime in the District of Columbia. This is the person who is underwriting the call girl operation at Columbia Plaza. Now, Kathy Heidi, I should say Kathy / Heidi, Erica, was forced to leave her sex for money operation when it was closed by police. But she soon began to manage this new operation at Columbia Plaza apartment complex. This is the one being underwritten by Joe Nesling. Okay. Often in the company of Philip Bailey, Kathy Heidi here, recruited at such Georgetown bars as Nathan's. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Nathan's. That was quite an up-and-coming meat market for young people in DC, where the line between young women who are just out to have a good time and those not averse to going to bed with a man for pay was often hard to discern. And Philip, of course, he's in there for his own hunting ground, but Heidi's in there looking for, sex workers. I'm trying to think of, God, I can't think of her name. The woman who was so well connected with Epstein. It was so much easier to have a woman go up and, solicit these women and say, hey, you look great, what's your work? Why don't you come over and I have a conversation with you at my apartments. We'll make a little money on the side. She was very effective at that. Anyway, one evening, Kathy / Heidi / Erica showed Bailey photos of herself with another young woman. Now, they were in bikinis and they were in a chorus line pose with legs raised. This is not that photograph, but I'm showing this to give an impression of what it must have been. And Kathy / Heidi / Erica said, the name of the other woman is Catherine. Well, Kathy Heidi's women's friends became known, all of them became known to Bailey by code names and nicknames, and this Catherine was soon given the nickname of Clout, as in that person's got a lot of clout. Clout was from Los Angeles, where she had met a man who had persuaded her to move to DC. Said, your prospects will be much better in the capital of government rather than the capital of entertainment. Well, Bailey, he kept a small pocket address book that soon became overloaded with names and nicknames and code names matched with phone numbers, because he just put everything into one book. The women he was soliciting and the women who were coming to him via his clientele, and then the women who he was meeting through Erica. As I'd say here, some denoted acquaintances, girlfriends, party girls, prostitutes, and law clients. There was no attempt to segregate names by categories. Shortly after Labor Day in 1971, Bailey met Clout and Kathy/Heidi/Erica. And this is an important date. This is the latter part of summer of 71, early part of summer 71. The Pentagon Papers broke, and Nixon, through Kissinger, other staff members were hunting down Dan Ellsberg. Then they were trying to create and shut down leaks through the plumbers, all during this period of time here. Now, Clout, as noted by Bailey, wow, she's really curvy, but boy, is she poised. She should be. She came out of a very fine Catholic girls' high school here in west side of Los Angeles. She was a graduate of Notre Dame Girls Academy. Well, at a subsequent meeting between Bailey and Kathy/Heidi, there was talk of a new source of business for Kathy's call girl. Bailey had been boasting, when they were out hanging out at Nathan's and other places, that, I got a lot of political connections. And she said, well, let's use them. Let's make use of this person who you say is with the DNC, this Spencer Oliver, whoever he is. We see him in the photograph right here. His job for the DNC was working as executive director for the Association of State Democratic Chairmen at the DNC at the Watergate. So when all these visiting chairmen would come into town, maybe they'd like a good time. And to help us understand this, remember Kathy/Heidi/Erica, she's making very little in her mind on running this operation. Because remember, the girl gets paid, her underwriter, Joe Nesling, gets paid, and then she's got to pay for the overhead of keeping this apartment, and whatever is left over, that's hers. So the only way she's going to make money is by volume business. So she's trying to up the volume. Now, the DNC, as I mentioned, is just a short walk from Columbia Plaza, which is where Heidi was running her business. And the thought was that someone, perhaps Spencer Oliver himself, would be able to steer these high rolling poles over to Kathy's business here. Now, Bailey, with his, Kathy/Heidi/Erica, you tell me you're so persuasive, you got all these friends, do something with it. So she said, go over to the DNC, find somebody, and if they can push business our way, I'll give them a commission on any customer we get from them. Well, in the winter of 71, Bailey goes over to the DNC to see if he can see his friend Oliver, but Oliver is away at the time. So Bailey goes away. He's got a full calendar of clients that he has to take care of. So he doesn't get back over to the DNC until February of now 72. And he has a little more success. Now, Spencer Oliver, is away again at this time. He's traveling the country, spending a lot of time getting ready for events coming down in the convention in Miami. But, and this is crucial, Oliver's secretary, Ida Wells, best known as Maxie Wells, she was in, and she agreed to see Bailey and to give him a full tour of the premises. And here's where it all starts, baby. We seldom get to see a layout of the DNC on the 6th floor of the Watergate building. But I'm going to use my cursor here to, wish I had a red pointer, but I'll use my cursor to circle some things here. In the lower center, you can see where it says the elevator, that's not, I'll use my cursor right. It says elevator lobby. This is crucial to us. And as you can see just to the left of that, where I'm circling my cursor, the stairs, the stairwells right there. Here, where I'm circling my cursor, is the famous door that has to be entered to get into the DNC. And as you can see, it leads into a wide array of offices. Now, the official story is continually telling us that they were going in there to get into Lawrence O'Brien's office and to get whatever information he had, both via his telephone or bugging the room or just into his file cabinet. Well, take a look over here in the lower right-hand corner where I'm circling my cursor now. This is the office of Larry O'Brien. And he's never there. He's in Florida. There's nothing in there. Also, what's crucial to us, look where it's at in relationship to where you see the address, all this bold text up here. That's Virginia Avenue. And directly across the street from Virginia Avenue is the Howard Johnsons. The technology they had at the time did not permit transmitting of electronic signals through solid walls. And look at all this solid walls and glass and furniture and all this stuff out here for a signal to get out and cross the street. Where people are interested at and where Watergate is all about is in these two offices in the upper center right here. The first one to the left, you see Office of the State Chairman. This is Spencer Oliver's. It looks right through a glass wall to the outdoors. There's nothing going to inhibit an electronic line of sight signal. Directly adjacent to that is his secretary, Ida Wells, Maxie Wells. She has her office right there. I'll come back to this, but I wanted to lay this out because this is what it's all about. Oop, get back here. Okay. On this stop by in February of '72, Bailey learned that Oliver was away a lot and that his office was almost always vacant. And this is crucial, his telephone was a private line separate from the DNC switchboard. That means when a call came in, it directly rang on that line. Was no secretary picking it up and saying, who do you want to talk to and what is your business? This was the perfect setup for what Kathy / Heidi / Eric, seen in the photograph here, had in mind. Oh, baby, did it ever. In Maxie Wells, the secretary, Bailey found someone at the DNC with someone who he could do business. I have friends who can make your out-of-town people happy at night. Oh, Bailey and Maxie, they got along really well. And now there's what I love. Bailey stressed that these were college-educated ladies and they're just down the street, referring to Columbia Plaza. And I always ask myself, what's wrong with high school educated prostitutes? But I guess these people, they needed to be upsold. So they're college educated. And Maxie Wells agreed to take part in the operation. She was going to get her taste of the action. She, and this is crucial, she would keep photos of the call girls in her locked file cabinet. So when a visiting Pole was interested, be directed to come into Maxie's office, she'd open up the file cabinet and he could flip through the photographs until he found a girl that he was interested in, and then a phone call would be made. In the privacy of Spencer offices, phone call would be made over to Kathy/Heidi/Erica's operation, and consenting adults would agree upon a price and a time, and off we'd go. Except for the CIA, because they're listening in on everything. Now, the transmitting devices that they're picking up on are coming from the call girl operation. Remember, the bedrooms are wired for room sound, and the phone where incoming and outgoing phone calls are made has a transmitter on it, and it's going to Lou Russell at a location, not in the Howard Johnson, but at a separate line of sight location. And he is listening and recording all of these business transactions. Okay. At about the same time that Bailey was helping to set up, this extension of Kathy Columbia Plaza operation, John Dean develops an interest in the Watergate headquarters. Dean was interested, remember, he's interested in demonstrator and developing his business for the president, in salacious political material. And that interest pointed him toward the Watergate. Dean presses Caulfield, you'll remember him, and Tony the Face Ulazewicz, for them to do a walkthrough of the DNC. And at first Caulfield said, there's nothing, well, I don't know why you want us to do that. There's nothing over there. But Dean pressed them. So Caulfield had his colleague, Tony, to go over there. Tony did so, but he came back and said, there's nothing over there. You think something's hot, there's nothing going on over there. Because Tony, he got a walkthrough, but he couldn't see anything that was really happening. But Dean, for our purposes, has now left his fingerprints on the DNC long before anybody else. During the winter, which we've been talking about, 71 going into 72 here, Kathy Heidi's business continued apace, with at least one client a day being referred to them through the DNC connections. Although other clients, including men from the State Department, major hotels, private club, and the Library of Congress, still water runs deep with those librarians, baby. Bailey's own conquests, which are totally separate, were also continuing. And as the spring of 1972 began, so did a time of reckoning. Soon, Bailey would stand accused of violations of the Mann Act, transporting young women across state lines for immoral purposes. The Mann Acts were not difficult to achieve in DC, since Maryland and Virginia state lines were but a few miles away in any direction. And on the morning of April 6, 72, 4 special agents of the FBI entered his law office, executed search warrants for Bailey's home and office. He was in court at the time defending, I don't know whether it was a pimp or a prostitute, when they seized several items from there. Included were 2 address books, his original and a copy which his sister had made for him. His sister had come in and was running his office for him. They were keeping it all in the family. Both address books contained the names, nicknames, telephone numbers of hundreds of women. At that time, Bailey was not yet arrested. One of the names in the address book was Maureen Biner. Maureen Biner was Clout, aka Catherine, who had been introduced to Bailey 6 months before. Maureen Biner was the girlfriend of John Dean. This is the man she had met in LA and who had persuaded her to move to DC. All right. This is a good time to take a little breather, answer any questions that you may have. If you need to step away for a few minutes, I'll be right here and answer any questions. So, Sandra stepped away. Oh, beautiful. Thank you very much, Sandra. Okay, let's get going, because I know I took a little, I was sort of enjoying the stroll down Columbia Plaza Lane there a little too much. How do we get into the Watergate? Well, here we go. A few weeks after the search of Bailey's home and office, Liddy said that he was called by Magruder. Now we're going to go off Columbia Plaza and Bailey and his troubles, and we're going to move over to committee to reelect the president. Gordon, do you think we could get into the Watergate? Well, Liddy didn't like the question. The target is being changed. If you'll recall, the target for Liddy always was the Democratic Convention in Miami. That's what Gemstone is all about. Magruder asked if a bug could be placed in Larry O'Brien's office. And I think I've demonstrated to you how ridiculous that is, but I'll go into it further here. Liddy said it was feasible to place a bug in O'Brien's office, but it was irrelevant because the party chairman's in Miami getting ready for the convention. Liddy knew what was happening on a macro scale here. But Magruder responded, and here's where Liddy is getting so chewed up because he's got to answer to this guy. There's still plenty of activity over there, Gordon. We want to know whatever is said in his office, just as if it was here. And Liddy had no choice but to acquiesce. There was nothing happening in Larry O'Brien's office. Liddy presumed erroneously that the order to target the DNC was coming from Mitchell. But boy, was he wrong. The order was coming from this gentleman right here, John Dean. So Dean was pushing Magruder, was pushing Liddy. And the reason the order came from Dean, that isn't obvious already, will be in a moment. Unbeknownst, I love to use that word, unbeknownst. Is there ever a word as beknownst? I've heard a comedian make a gag on that. Beknownst. No, I don't think beknownst is a word, but we have unbeknownst. Unbeknownst to Liddy, the target of the bugging was not Larry O'Brien. It was never going to be Larry O'Brien. Rather, the target was the phone in Spencer Oliver's office, the one that was being used to set up dates at Kathy Heidi's call girl operation at Columbia Plaza. And there we can see an interior shot. This is of Maxie Wells's office. Allegedly, the first break-in at the DNC of Watergate commences on May 27th, 1972. But check this out. Well, that's not so. McCord had hired another associate to monitor conversations from a room in the nearby Howard Johnson's. This room had a line of sight with both Columbia Plaza and Watergate. What they recognize is that Dean is pushing Magruder, who's pushing Liddy to get into the Watergate. We're going to have to respond in some manner. And this inquiry, this demand that's coming from the White House, is going to mess with our surveillance, speaking of the CIA surveillance of the call girl operation. We got to deal with it in some way, though. So McCord hires somebody else to sit and listen to conversations that might be coming from the DNC, specifically Spencer Oliver's office that's directly across the street, and the only thing between them are two panes of glass. this shows a good image of it right there. So we can see surrounding it are the condominiums, but in the center you see the hotel, the office building, and the Howard Johnsons directly across the street. The transmitting and receiving equipment they had at that time required this kind of proximity. McCord's associate was Alfred Baldwin III, an unemployed law graduate. He hadn't passed the bar, who had a brief tenure with FBI. He worked for the FBI for 6 months. Why they let him go or he chose to leave, I don't know. But get this. As I just mentioned, ostensibly the first entry into DNC is on the 27th, but look at this. On the night of May 26th, Baldwin, who's sitting in his little lookout position over in the Howard Johnson, he sees his employer, James McCord, inside the nighttime offices of the DNC. He sees lights go on and curtains be pulled in those most exterior office buildings there. So before any attempted break-in by the Liddy Hunt team, McCord, James McCord, former CIA, was already there, and he had gotten in by himself. But what he was doing there, we don't really know. We have a pretty good idea. The reason we don't know for certain is that there was never a police investigation of the break-in of the DNC. We're going to be looking at the break-in that will occur in June, and then the arrest of those individuals who were there. But the DC police never did a complete investigation because they said, oh, the crime is solved, case closed, move on. They never looked back to see if anything preceded that event. If they had, they would have gotten into the 27th and the 28th, the 26th. So McCord has come in on his own and is doing something. The following night, what I call the Patsy break-in team, which included these CIA assets, Frank Sturgis, Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, Virgilio Gonzalez, and James McCord, entered the building. But get this, they achieved nothing. It's very similar to the event from a year ago when Hunt went in with two of these gentlemen into the psychiatrist's office in Beverly Hills. As before, this attempt was a fiasco, and it was a fiasco orchestrated by James McCord. It was intended. McCord, the so-called technical expert, he didn't bring the right equipment that time. And Gonzalez, the locksmith, he didn't bring the correct lock-picking tools. So the break-in team had to postpone from the 27th now to the 28th. On this second occasion, the team was successful, or at least Liddy was given to think so. This is what he wrote up. McCord reported success, and Barker had 2 rolls of 35mm film he expended on material from O'Brien's desk, along with Polaroid shots of other offices before anything was touched, so it could all be returned to the proper order before leaving. Oh, Gordon, I want to say to you, from the, into the grave, how wrong you were, baby. How wrong you were. Images from the 2 35mm rolls, they wouldn't surface for weeks because ostensibly McCord had to find a trustworthy film processor. He wasn't going to just take it down to 1-hour photo and have these things done. And check this out. When these images were produced, They showed offices other than Larry O'Brien's. But Liddy, never having been there, he didn't know this. They were pulling the shag carpet over Liddy's eyes. And I'll make a gag. Why I make that gag about shag carpet, I'll reveal in a moment. In fact, the photos that surfaced were shot by McCord himself in the control room at the Howard Johnson's across Virginia Avenue, where they had shag carpet on the floor. So McCord's deceit toward Liddy is growing and will only grow further. Further, Liddy discovered that only one of McCord's bugs was being picked up, and this one wasn't even in O'Brien's office. What's more, the microphone was from a phone, not from a room bug transmitting all office conversations. And in the control room, the Howard Johnson room directly across Virginia, there was no tape recorder to capture the conversations. McCord's explanation to Liddy was that, most of the information coming over the DNC, it's just useless. And I've got a man listening on the headphones and he's going to type a log of it and he's going to edit out all of the junk. Of course, this is in sharp contrast to what Lou Russell, his other, associate, is doing. Liddy told McCord, I want all the conversations. And he took the logs of the conversations that had been captured, and he discovered that they were from a phone other than Larry O'Brien's. Now, Watergate burglar Eugenio Martinez would later reveal that the tap was neither placed in O'Brien's office nor in his phone, as I said, because it never would have worked from there to begin with. The tap was on the phone in Spencer Oliver's office. This was perfect, given that it was directly across the street from the receiving equipment in the Howard Johnson's control room. Now, I'm going to take a moment here just to observe here. We never hear all the information I'm presenting to you, of course, is in the source books right there. We never hear any of this in the official story, but this is what's happening. As mentioned earlier, the man who sat in the control room was Alfred Baldwin. Baldwin would later testify that the bug that had been placed was working. He would later testify that the target all along was the Spencer Oliver phone. The overheard conversations pertained to Kathy, Heidi / Erica's call girl operation. Baldwin would later recount that the logged phone conversations were of an embarrassing sexual nature, explicitly intimate. As I made the gag on it, those that were into cross-dressing, those were into spanking and the like. It all came out. There were those arrangements. Liddy was frustrated that no one in the committee to re-elect the president seemed to be interested in the poor quality of information that this phone bug was bringing forward. And he kept asking McCord for the photographic fruit of the break-in, kept getting the same lame excuse of, I'm having difficulty getting someone to develop them. Someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut. Liddy had no need for making another surreptitious entry into the Watergate, and he thought no one else did either. But as we've seen before, Liddy is being kept in the dark. He'd been intentionally excluded from the knowledge that the target was not Larry O'Brien's, that it was Spencer Oliver. It would later be revealed that it was Hunt who gave the specific targets to the break-in team at Watergate. But this begs the question, who is giving orders to E. Howard Hunt right here, huh? Again, I want to take note. I hadn't noticed this before. Look at his left hand right there. He's holding a pipe. I guess it was de rigueur. If you want to be taken seriously in this crowd, you had to have a pipe. It was CIA which did not want a White House operation being ordered by John Dean interfering and thus ruining their call girl operation. They had a good thing going. They got Lou Russell in a separate control room, picking up all these conversations, and they got John Dean now trying to get this surveillance team in there. They've got to mess it up. Hunt had documented the orders that had been given to him, and he noted these orders in operational notebooks that recorded the progress of scaled-back gemstone scheme from its inception, including mentions of its principals, Mitchell, Magruder, and Dean. This will be consequential next week on our final episode, because Hunt is documenting everything in notebooks. But guess what's going to happen? Spoiler! As a side note, Hunt's notebooks were made by Hermé. This guy had good taste, baby. He went out and bought, high-class quality notebooks, not like those address books that Philip Bailey had that you get from the drugstore. Eventually, Dean would admit to destroying Hunt's Hermé notebooks and other documents. Why? To cover up his complicity. Dean would admit this only after he pleaded guilty to one and only one count of an indictment, after the government had agreed to drop the other counts. I'll get more into, the crime and punishment of John Dean in part 2 of this here. But Dean, who will take a pretty substantial sentencing, he'll be the first person to be sentenced, but then that'll all get knocked down. And they'll never be able to go after him for double jeopardy when he confesses to many other things that he was part of, including destruction of evidence, as we see right here. These notebooks and other documents were evidence that could have linked Dean with the Watergate break-in. Not that they would have exculpated someone like E. Howard Hunt, but we would have, and the government would have had a more complete picture at the outset if these notebooks had been discovered. Okay, we're going to close out here with naked ladies, as I like to say, love bears all. It was early June of '72. Federal grand jury had been investigating Bailey here since April after seizure of his records and photographs from his home and office. Although there had been only one complainant, only one woman out of the hundreds that Bailey had had relationships with, only one complained, and the complaint went up to this gentleman who we see here, Assistant U.S. Attorney John Rudy, who developed other charges against Bailey through testimony of friends and acquaintances, and from several women who were now prepared to testify against his sexual practices, but nowhere near the many whom he had relationships with. The question comes up, how were these witnesses identified and interviewed? We don't really know, but one suspects that CIA had something to do with it. On June 9th, there was a modest article in a paper that is no longer in printing, the Washington Daily News, and this was their headline, "Lawyer Charged with White Slavery," but it appeared on the interior pages of the paper. However, the night final edition of a competing paper, the Washington Star, replaced their front page story about a bombing of Hanoi with this headline, "Capitol Hill Call Girl Ring Uncovered." It named Bailey as the head of the operation, which was false, and reported that he had denied charges entirely, which was accurate. Sources close to the investigation were cited as saying that clients of the operation were prominent DC attorneys and members of the State Department and judges and all kinds of people, but they don't mention that. So you can see how slanted the article was being at early on here. How had the Star found out about Bailey's involvement in the call girl operation? Because we had said the only thing that he had to do with it was helping to extend Kathy's her client list down over there. And why was the Columbia Plaza ring not mentioned in the article? Because they never mention it. They just say a call girl ring that Bailey ran. False information. As Mark Twain said, if you don't read the newspapers, you're uninformed. If you read the newspapers, you're misinformed. And that's what's going on here. Back to the attorney. He appears not to have known about the Columbia Plaza operation. This is the guy investigating it. His office, therefore, had not told reporters about it, and obviously Bailey wouldn't have revealed it. Bailey was actually peripheral to the call girl ring, and he wasn't eventually charged with having anything to do with it. He was facing jail time, disbarment, and fines for his involvement with women who were not part of the ring. It was all his business of, going out to the bar and picking up girls to bringing them home. In an extraordinary move, John Dean telephoned the federal investigator here, Rudy, directly. And you'll get this. He calling up, I'm calling on behalf of the President of the United States, and demanded that the prosecutors come right over and bring all documentary evidence identified with people involved in the ring. Well, Rudy and the head of criminal division, a guy named Don Smith, they head over to the White House. First time they've been over on a call like this. And they brought with them what they had, Bailey's address book. And I love this, 50 to 60 photos of the women, which had been seized in April.
Called me 3 times in the last 20 minutes.
But wouldn't have been seized in April. As if 5 or 6 wouldn't have been enough. They brought over a stack. Well, upon seeing the Bailey address book, this became Dean's main focus. And although he knew it was improper, Dean asked them to keep the address book and the photos. Though he concealed this to Rudy and Smith, Dean could see that the address book contained the name of Mo Biner, his live-in girlfriend, with her nickname of Clout. And there they were. There's Dean and Maureen. Well, the prosecutors denied the request. Dean asked him, well, can I at least copy the address book so I could compare it to a list of White House personnel to see if any names appeared in both? Ordinarily, this request would be denied, but the prosecutors were, after all, dealing with the president's lawyer, and so the request was considered reasonable. So Dean had the address book photocopied, and he meticulously compared it to White House personnel lists. And after the prosecutors left, Dean called a mid-level official in an agency across from the White House and told him that, hey, one of your female attorneys who's serving under him, her name's in this address book. And he'd seen her nude photo as taken by Bailey. That same day, later in the afternoon, called on the carpet this female attorney who had no connection to the call girl ring, said she had been briefly in love with Bailey and allowed him to take her photo. She denied any wrongdoing, but by 5:30 that afternoon, she had her walking papers. Now, he now had a scalp to show for his efforts. Should he ever be questioned about it, Dean did not make a permanent record of this meeting with Rudy and Smith, as we've seen a little bit last week. And we'll see Dean records meetings that don't take place, and he sometimes leaves off the records meetings that do take place. Dean is very good about making a record that reflects well on him. Okay, we're going to close out with bad bug. We always want to blame the technology, but sometimes it's not the technology, it's the people behind it. Liddy, having had problems with McCord and the material coming from the bug in the DNC, the logs from McCord, which he said came from Baldwin, which Liddy re-edited and had his secretary type up, showed nothing of interest. Liddy was almost embarrassed then to pass them on, but he had to show something for his efforts. Remember, they've spent $250,000 on, this part of Operation Gemstone. Not all of it's going toward this, but they're spending money on this. So he put the transcribed logs, such as they were, into an envelope for Magruder with expectations that he would give this material to Mitchell. According to Liddy, he was called into Magruder's office shortly afterward, June 12th, and he was again asked by Magruder if the bug could be replaced. Well, Liddy said, yeah, but there's no money in the budget, for another entry. We've got to be looking at McGovern's headquarters. We've got to be looking at Miami. But Magruder got to the heart of the matter. And this is a very famous anecdote. Whether it happened or not, God only knows. But Magruder bangs on the lower left drawer of his own desk and says to Liddy, here's what I want to know. I want to know what O'Brien's got right here. Well, Liddy understood the reference, for in that drawer he knew Magruder kept his own derogatory information on the Democrats. Now, Magruder would later admit that it was Dean, not Mitchell, who directed him to order Liddy and his men to go back into the DNC to obtain this information. So there it is. That same day, that is June 12th, Maxie Wells received a visitor at the DNC, and this is someone who's not looking for business. He announces himself as Bill Bailey, but it's actually McCord's assistant. The guy in the control room over at the Howard Johnson, Alfred Baldwin III. Now, what in the world is he going back over there for? Going in there, he'd never been there before. Baldwin was sent into the DNC to get a layout of the place, ostensibly. But this begs the question, why would McCord send Baldwin in to get the lay of the place if he'd already been there on a break-in and the burglars knew the setup? Well, Baldwin made sure that he saw Maxie Wells by telling the receptionist that he was a friend of Spencer Oliver. This was like going into a speakeasy. I'm a friend of Spencer Oliver's. During his brief go-round and meeting with Maxie Wells, Baldwin apparently picked up a file cabinet key from the secretary's desk and removed the bug from Oliver's phone. How do we know this? We don't. But at the time of the second break-in was foiled, and we'll get into this next week, a copy of the key to Wells's cabinet would be found in the possession of burglar Eugenio Martinez. And this is a photograph from police evidence, just what they took off him. And just one day before the June 17th break-in, but after this visit by Baldwin, the telephone company had swept the DNC phones for bugs, and they didn't find any. And just after the break-in, the police and FBI, they made their own sweeps and found no in-place bugs. Somehow, on this little visit, Baldwin stole both the key to Wells's desk and removed whatever bug McCord had placed on Oliver's phone on his solo May 26th visit. And I want to offer this humorous cartoon, which I think sums up so much for us. And the caption reads, "This may come as a shock to you, Mr. Hathaway, but I didn't come here to discuss international relations." All right, and with that, we close out episode 3, Sex, Lies, and Audio Tape. And I'll close out my share here, and let's have a conversation. I know I treat this rather lighthearted because it really is so human, and it reveals to us what's really going on with these characters. Come on, Margaret, you got something.
I'd just like to say that it is amusing because you have to put yourself back in the 1970s to even understand this. I'm thinking about it and saying, today, not one kid listening to this would say, what's the big deal? You know, so what if they're naked? So what if they're sending pictures? I mean, it was such a different time back then. It like, when I'm looking back and saying, oh my gosh, yes, that's what happened. Oh my gosh, yes, that's what happened. And to us, it was shocking. Nowadays, we wouldn't even flinch over it. If you think about it, I mean, it would be like, yeah, okay, what else is new? Wouldn't make big headlines.
Just goes
But
show
it's-
where the morals
It's
are.
50 years ago, it was news. You know, and I do say to some degree, some parts of it would be, the photographs, not so much, but the whole notion of a call girl ring and having influential people, you know, partake in it. You know, and then they go off into the, if they're a legislator and they go off and they're voting for certain pieces of legislation that are contravening that, that sort of hypocrisy would tweak a few people, but anyway. Bob and Kathy, what's going on in your neck of the woods?
Well, you know, you bring up the pictures are just common things today.
Yeah.
While I was in Vietnam, you know, I was over there in 68 and 69. I had friends who had their parents and friends send over the Sears and J.C. Penney catalogs, and you say, why? So guys could look at the women in their underwear.
Oh my gosh.
So you think it's bad now? That was really bad, you know, back then, you know.
It could get past those catalogs could get past the censor.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, shit. Oh, yeah. But you
Barbara,
know,
go ahead. Kathy, you were going to say something?
I want to be very careful. I just think that there's too many common threads through this. I think a lot has to go back to Johnson before he became president. After he became president, what he was doing, what we don't know what he was doing over these 4 to 5 years that this all happened, because I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we will never know about, because the guy was so dirty. And I think he had control of a lot of the agencies, all the alphabet agencies. And the thing that the corruption started so far back then, I don't know how we'll ever clean it out. And I really don't. I mean, just the agents, they're self-sustaining now.
Right.
And they're out of control. So I don't know how, I don't know how you know, everyone says they could do a reset. You know, I don't think so. I think they've established themselves that there's procedures in place that even at the appointees, let's say, for example, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole for a second. The CIA director is appointed by the president. Even if we remove them, they have the workings in place to continue to do what they're doing through their black ops.
Right.
And there's so many contractors making money, and it's all about the money today.
Right.
Like, think about it. It's all about the money.
Yep.
So I don't know how you do it. I just, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, we're all looking for that reset button, Bob.
No, never. I don't think it's going to happen.
It's never going to happen. Barbara, anything from you?
Let me get my microphone back on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. One of the things that, having been in the Kennedy class as well, and now, you know, moving forward in history with all this, that you haven't talked a lot about is the personal financial gains that Johnson and his family received because of their interest in, I think it was what, Bell's Labs? With
Bell Helicopter and General Dynamics.
Bell Helicopter, yeah. And one of the things, and I don't even know where I heard it, had to do with Nixon being brought out of office or trying to get him to resign. he resigned because of money interests that if they became known would damage his reputation. And I haven't heard anything about the money, his earlier money dealings that might have come out that would have damaged his reputation. I mean, did you come across any of that, or?
We'll get into that in part 2 of this course, where we have not only the Special Prosecutor's Office and the Justice Department investigation under Sirica, and we also have the Senate Investigative Committee. We think we know that story, but it has as many tangents and new information as I'm bringing forward to you here. The big thing that's going to come after Nixon, aside, he's nothing like Johnson, is an attempt to take a tax deduction for his materials, and that will be denied. But the government and the prosecutors will make a big issue of his attempt to have this tax deduction, but that will be resolved. I'll get into that in part 2. You know, the big thing for Nixon, as you may recall, are some, and I can't point my finger to the specifics of it, although I have read about it, goes back to his early years in the vice presidency under Eisenhower, when he was accused of misusing campaign funds, and he gave this, historic Checkers speech. My little dog we were given this little dog Checkers here, and then of course he has that famous line, and my wife does not have mink coats as being alluded here. She wears a fine Republican cloth coat. And he gave a remarkable defiant speech that on that occasion. And Eisenhower, who was ready to jettison him, kept him on the ticket. But that goes back to the 50s. And we'll get into money problems, money issues with Nixon in part 2 of this, Barbara.
Okay, the other thing that would be helpful to me personally, and I'm not suggesting you do this, but in my mind, I would love to see a timeline, multiple timelines of these different events that are going on. So you can see from timeline to timeline to timeline how events are happening in parallel and where they cross over. Because there's so many threads to this that it's difficult to keep it all straight.
Okay.
That's just my thought.
No, I appreciate that, and I think it's a very good suggestion. Go ahead.
Along that line, John, the thing that I am struggling with is who reports to who? And if there was a
Org chart.
org chart,
chart.
or even, and I know there's a
Sure.
lot of dotted lines, I got that one, but that's where I get very confused.
Okay, I'll work on that.
Mhm.
Those are good
Thank you.
suggestions. I want to say we're running 5 minutes over our time here. I want to be very considerate of Sandra and the staff at OLLI right there. Let's pick this up next Monday, and we'll continue, and I'll see what I can put together during the coming week here for us. I recognize that would be valuable. There's a lot of players on the field here, and they're only going to increase.
All
Right.
right. Thank you.
Right.
Thank
All
you.
right.